Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's program titled The FCC's E-Rate Overhaul and its Impact on Indian Country, What You Need to Know and What Tribes Can Do to Advance Their Interests. My name is Randy Evans. I'm an attorney in private practice, and I am also the chair of the Tribal Telecom Advisory Council. I'll be your host for today's program. Our speaker today is Jim Dunstan. As a matter of personal introduction, I was raised in northwest New Mexico on and near the Navajo Reservation. My wife Sharon and our 3 children are enrolled members of the Navajo Nation. Before I formally introduce Jim and before he jumps into the substance of today's program, I wanted to take just a couple minutes to cover a few housekeeping items. First, I wanted to just talk briefly about Tribal Telecom and about the annual Tribal Telecom Conference. The annual Tribal Telecom and Technology Conference serves as a gathering place to share information, explore solutions, and create new possibilities for pathways across the digital divide in Indian country, and to make information and communications technologies accessible to American Indian and Alaska Native communities. Key areas of focus for the conference include infrastructure, community and economic development, culture, education and government, and public safety, emergency management, and health. Our 4th annual Tribal Telecom Conference will be held in Albuquerque, New Mexico next year on May 4 through 7, 2015. So be sure and mark that on your calendars, and also check the conference website. We're going to have the online registration up just in the next day or so. The website for the conference is just simply tribaltelecomconference.com. Following our very successful 2014 conference in February of this year, we received a lot of requests for year-round educational opportunities that expand on and supplement the topics that are addressed at the annual conference. The Tribal Telecom webinar series marks the beginning of our efforts to respond to these requests. As for today's agenda, Jim is going to be speaking for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to leave plenty of time at the end after his formal presentation for questions and answers. If you do have questions, we would ask that you use the question box on the webinar toolbar. You can type in your questions either during the program or following Jim's presentation. And now to introduce today's speaker. We're very fortunate to have Jim Dunstan as our presenter for this inaugural Tribal Telecom webinar. As many of you know, Jim is a telecommunications regulatory attorney in private practice. He has extensive experience working on issues involving communications and broadband service delivery in Indian country. You can find more information about Jim on his website, which is mobiuslegal.com, mobiuslegal.com. His contact information is also available at the end of this presentation. With that, I'll now turn the program over to Jim.
Okay, thanks, Randy. Can everybody hear me, I hope, Randy?
We hear you loud and clear.
Good, great. We're going to switch control so I get the screen, and it's coming my way. Does that look fine? I hope so. Okay, let me get, great. All right, so here's the presentation outline, and I'll begin this by saying when Randy sort of canvassed the board of advisors for Tribal Telecom, he asked what subjects we should be covering in these webinars, and one of the things I responded back was we really should cover the changes in the E-Rate program because it is such an important program, as well as the fact that we've had the first major revision of it in 17 years just occurred last month, and so we thought it was very topical, and we thought it would be a great one to start the series off by doing this. So, of course, having suggested it, I get to present it. I guess that's the way it always happens. Never volunteer. So the other thing I'd like to just give my kind of personal background. I'm originally from Arizona, grew up in first Casa Grande and then Tempe, Arizona, and unfortunately or fortunately, I've now spent more than half of my life in the Washington, D.C. area, and that sort of comes with the territory of coming to law school here and kind of getting Potomac fever and staying. But it's been a great career for me. I've enjoyed it, and I've really enjoyed the last 5 or so years being involved with a lot of tribal telecom issues. It's been very, very rewarding for me personally. So let's talk about the E-rate program. The presentation outline you see on your screen there. So I'm going to discuss the E-rate program generally to give some introduction. Some of you may know it very well. Others of you may not have participated in the E-rate program, and so this background information may be very important to you. We're next going to talk about the FCC's recent order released July 23rd. That was when it was written. It wasn't actually released till at least a week after that. So it's very, very new and fresh, hot off the presses. And what the FCC is doing with the program, specifically to try and solve what they call the Wi-Fi crisis in schools, and their attempts to simplify the E-rate program. Next, I'm going to really drill down and get specific as to what the program has meant and could mean for tribal schools and libraries. And finally, in that report and order issued by the Commission, they also issued a further notice of proposed rulemaking, in which they ask a number of questions, some of them very specific to Indian country, and so we're going to cover that as well. And then, as Randy said at the beginning, we will have a good 15 minutes of Q&A. If I say something that you just don't understand, I've missed something horribly, go ahead and type in your question, and I've instructed either Randy to go ahead and jump in with those questions. If there are questions of kind of more general nature, I'll probably defer them to the end. So let's get going with the next slide. There we go. All right, so E-rate Basics. The official title of it is the Schools and Libraries Program of the Universal Service Fund. It's commonly known as E-rate. How it got that name is a little bit up to conjecture. Some people say that it's called E-rate because the hope was that service providers would eventually adopt a set of rates for schools which would be better than they provide other customers, and that there would be a special educational rate or special E-rate. As we'll see as we go through, that hasn't necessarily happened, although the rules do require that carriers charge schools and libraries no more than they charge other customers for the same types of services. So E-rate was established in 1997 and was made part of the 1996 Telecom Act by Congress, and FCC then implemented rules the next year. A little bit of background data. At that time, in 1997, only 14% of classrooms had access to the Internet, and of those, 74% had only dial-up connections, which shouldn't be that surprising if you think that far back. If you can think that far back to 1976, the state of the Internet and the state of connections was much different than it was today. So it is a $2.4 billion a year program. That's billion with a B, that provides subsidies up to a 90%, what's known as a discount rate, to schools and libraries to purchase Internet connectivity and other services. So in other words, if your school gets a bill from the carrier for $1,000 a month and you qualify at the 90% discount level, the USAC, through the FCC, will pay $90 of it, and you are only on the hook for $10 of it. So obviously it's a very important program for all schools and libraries. By 2005, nearly 94% of classrooms had internet access, and by 2006, nearly 98% of public libraries had internet access, and of these, 51% received E-rate support. So it's been a successful program. Many schools and many libraries have participated in it to their advantage. Now, back to the discount rate for a moment here. It's a sliding scale based predominantly on the percentage of students that are in the National School Lunch Program. And as you could summarize, most tribal schools and tribal libraries would be at or near that 90% discount rate based on the level of poverty that's found on most Native Nation reservations. So for those who do participate, it's a nice subsidy. So the subsidies can be applied to 5 general categories of services, and it's really important that we differentiate what were known as Priority 1 services versus Priority 2 services. Basically, Priority 1 services, think of it as everything getting connected to the school or the library. So it's the connections, it's the equipment required to make the connections and to get you internet access, as well as telephone service. The priority 2 services are for what are known as internal connections and basic maintenance of internal connections. So that would be distributing the signal throughout the school, and as we'll talk about soon, including wireless or Wi-Fi connections. The problem is, under the old rules, the priority 1 services had to all be funded before anybody got priority 2 services. So if the demand on the fund for priority 1 services all the way down to the lowest discount level took up all the money in the fund, then there was no money left for priority 2 services. And that's been the case more often than not. I believe only 1 or 2 years in the last 10 years has there been any money left over for priority 2 services. Now, what's not covered, and this is as important as what is covered. What isn't covered are the personal computers or other devices that can connect to the internet via these connections. And that's important, especially for a tribe that is looking to get their schools or libraries into the program, is that you've got to bring your own hardware to the table to make those connections. You cannot use E-rate funding to buy personal computers or to buy tablets or smartphones or any other device to put in the hands of students or library patrons. And so because of that, that's actually been one of the significant impediments and reasons many tribal schools and libraries don't participate, is because it does cost a hefty chunk of change to put together the hardware to connect to the internet. All right, so what has E-rate meant to Indian country? As I said, it's been a very, very successful program, $2.4 billion a year. But the problem is, we don't know what the impact has been in Indian country. The FCC has not ever collected data on how many tribal schools participate. The Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Indian Education does not collect participation data. And it does appear that participation is quite low, as I said, despite the fact that many tribal schools would qualify for the 90% support tier. Now, in terms of any data that we have, and we have very little on it, there is a 2011 study from the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums, ATALM, which showed that 46% of tribal libraries, the only source of free public Wi-Fi, free public internet access in their communities, and yet less than 5% of tribal libraries receive E-rate support. So compare that to the earlier data, which indicated that 51% of public libraries participate in E-rate, and less than 5% of tribal libraries receive E-rate support. So clearly, there's a big divide as part of that the digital divide here. So why isn't that? Why haven't tribes participated? Well, the ATLM study identified 3 barriers to participation, the first 2 of which apply equally to tribal schools. And the first is generally a lack of awareness of the E-rate program. Many tribes just don't understand about the E-rate program. The second one is the complicated application process. And yes, E-rate is an extremely complicated program. We'll get to some of the FCC efforts to simplification in a little bit, but it still remains a highly complicated program to participate in. And finally, as to libraries, and this is distinct from schools, there's a lot of uncertainty about eligibility. Tribal libraries have to be eligible for state support and receive a letter from the state librarian saying that they receive state support before they can apply for E-rate. And for obvious reasons, that's somewhat difficult for many tribes to do. They don't participate in state library programs as often as not, and state librarians aren't necessarily inclined to issue a letter saying that they participate in state programs if they don't. I could go on for about 2 hours on why this is wrong as a matter of law, and certainly as a matter of policy in terms of infringing on tribal sovereignty, but we'll just leave it as it's a problem. The second problem with tribal libraries is they often don't look like traditional public libraries. You think of the ivy-covered halls of college or school libraries or even public libraries. They're often located in multi-use buildings. such as chapter houses or meeting houses within a native nation, and so they often just don't look like libraries. And in the past, USAC, which I'll talk about a little bit, has sort of frowned upon tribal libraries that are housed in multi-use facilities because they just don't think they look like libraries. They don't act like libraries, and so that's an additional problem that tribal libraries have faced in terms of participation. So back to the complicated part. Is it complicated? Yes, it is. It's an incredibly complicated program. There are multiple sets of forms that have to be filled out precisely. There's the Form 470, the Form 471, 480, 481. There's a whole bunch of sets of programs. And they have to all be submitted to what's known as the Universal Service Administration Company, or USAC, and you'll hear that term a lot. USAC is a nonprofit corporation that was set up specifically to implement the E-rate, the Universal Service Fund program, and E-rate as part of that. And so they are the ones that collect all these forms. They're the ones that make the decisions as to whether or not you get funding. Ultimately, if they deny funding, you have the right of appeal to the FCC on that, but they're the sort of the first line of defense. These forms have to be filled out in very tight filing windows. And the schedule for the forms on a yearly basis are designed to match school years, not calendar years or tribal government fiscal years. So you get in a situation where you have to file your Form 470 in January of a year for internet access for services that you want to be supplied in August, and so. And so, whoa, I just lost my screen. I hope everybody didn't lose theirs. Randy, you want to hop back on and tell me what you're seeing?
So right now we're seeing the PowerPoint slide. You want to click on Enable Editing, and hopefully that'll pull it back up.
Okay. All right, yeah, that came back up. All right, thanks. I just got a strange message. So the filing deadlines are tight. The schedules don't really match well with fiscal years or even calendar years. And the final thing is the forms are pretty strictly adjudicated by USAC. And so failure to adhere to the rules and the deadlines may and often does result in either denial of funding or, even worse, being required to refund amounts to USAC. So imagine this now. You're a 90% discount rate school, and let's say you've got an E-rate contract for $50,000, and good, you only have to pay $5,000 of it. Well, somewhere down the road, excuse me, USAC determines that you haven't met the criteria of the program. That $50,000 has already gone out to your service provider. Well, lo and behold, you now have to refund back $45,000 to USAC because they found out something's wrong. And so, the penalties are pretty draconian. They're pretty fierce here if you don't get it right. So many E-rate filers have to end up hiring consultants to assist them, and the amounts paid to consultants are not reimbursable by the E-rate program. So even though you may be a 90% discount rate school, if you have to pay, X thousands of dollars, $10,000s of dollars to a consultant to oversee to make sure you get everything right, well, that's an additional cost for you. And frankly, many tribes, and certainly many smaller tribes that haven't got huge E-rate programs, simply can't afford to hire the consultants to help them out on this. And so that's, again, another reason why participation in Indian country has been so low. So, as I said, the program's been very successful in many, many measures, but it's also been highly controversial because of the amount of waste, fraud, and abuse that's been found with the program. Both sides, in terms of political parties, have taken their shot at it. The Government Accounting Office has issued report after report deeming E-rate to be the most fraught with abuse of any government program in the country. There are dozens of people who are currently incarcerated, in jail, for defrauding the E-rate program. It is a crime, and there are probably, I don't know this for a fact, but just from what I know and what I've heard, probably 10 times that many of people who are under current active investigation for defrauding the program. The typical types of abuse that we find are people inside a school or a library steering an E-rate contract to a service provider in exchange for a kickback. Lesser but still documented, consultants who steer E-rate contracts to preferred vendors for a kickback. And finally, and the one that's really pernicious and very tough to deal with is the carriers themselves, in many instances trying to be helpful, helping E-rate recipients fill out their forms. Well, they can help on some of the forms, but they can't help on some of the other forms, especially the Form 470, which is like an RFP, request for proposals, because USAC deems that to give the carrier an unfair advantage. And so those situations are certainly out there a lot. So really, is it any wonder why tribes have steered clear of this program by and large? Yet, again, it is a hugely important program. There's a lot of money there if we can find ways to get tribes to participate. So the FCC looked at the situation. Again, E-rate was enacted in 1997. We're now 17 years later, and FCC recognized there was a real need for reform within the program. And so they set forth 3 goals they want to achieve with this reform. One was ensuring a high-speed broadband sufficient to bring those signals into the classroom on a wireless basis, what they sort of deem as the Wi-Fi crisis. Many schools have high-speed connections, but they're only into 1 or 2 computer labs. And the idea of of bringing it all the way to a one-to-one basis to the student hasn't been achieved. And so that was their primary goal. The second was to try and find ways to better maximize the cost effectiveness of the money that they were spending, because there are some very expensive E-rate programs out there and some very cheap in terms of the cost per megabit that recipients are paying. And so they want to try to find a way to make the program more cost effective. And finally, they recognized the complexity of the program and wanted to find ways to make the E-rate application process smoother, faster, quicker, and get the money in the hands of recipients sooner. There have been many instances, as again, as I said, you start filing forms in January for services to be received beginning in August, and sometimes you're not approved for that money until September, October, November, or maybe even to the next calendar year. Well, what do you do at that point? I mean, some service providers will go ahead and provide the service, figuring that you're going to get approved for the funding, but some simply will withhold the service, and you don't get service during that time. So the idea was, well, we got to make this faster. So the Wi-Fi crisis really stems in part from President Obama's Connect Ed initiative, in which he stated that it was a goal by 2017 to bring speeds of at least 100 megabits and possibly as high as 1 gigabit to 99% of the students in the country. That's a lofty goal, and that's going to take a lot of work to do. Now, some of us who can be cynical on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays sometimes say, well, is that the administration's way of saying if 99% of the students get this, the other 1% doesn't, and who's in that 1%? Is it Indian country by definition because of the rural nature of most reservations? Yeah, I'm not willing to go there, but it certainly does raise an eyebrow. So what does this mean for the E-rate program? How do we get to that 100 megabits per second to 99% of the students? Well, one, obviously we have to have very fast connections into the schools and libraries, but we also have to make Wi-Fi. We have to make wireless services available within the schools and libraries to allow the students to connect into. The problem with this is that Wi-Fi, as I mentioned before, fell under internal connections, making it a priority 2 services. And so up until this order, you didn't get to those services until the priority 1 services were all met, and that wasn't happening. So the problem is you can't get there from here, some of my friends in Maine would say. So what did the FCC said? Well, they said we're going to eliminate this term priority completely, and we're going to replace it with the word category. Now, some people have jumped on this and saying, "Oh, well, you know, great reform, Commission. You changed two words and declare victory." Well, if it were just that, you know, that would be justified. But in fact, what the Commission said is, no, we're not going to talk about priorities now. We're going to talk about categories. So the things that used to be priority 1 are now category 1. The things that were priority 2 are now category 2. But the Commission said we're no longer going to say only category 1 gets funded until all of category 1 gets funded. Instead, we're going to place them basically on equal footing. And the Commission said to bridge that Wi-Fi gap, what we're going to do is we're going to set aside $1 billion a year for the next few years to fund this separate internal connection for Wi-Fi's. And they're going to do that with some savings to be recognized by phasing out certain services. There literally are still services like paging that are supported under E-rate, which the Commission said should go away immediately, and gradually telephone services. So those schools and libraries that rely on E-rate to bring the basic telephone into schools and libraries over the next 5 years are going to see that support decrease until it goes down to 0 in 5 years. The other thing they said is we're only going to support the Wi-Fi connections up to a maximum of an 85% discount rate. And so you can say, well, okay, 85, that's close to 90%. Well, we'll get to this in a little while, but it definitely shows that the Commission is not real keen on providing all or almost all of the funding necessary for E-rate support. They basically drew a line in the sand and said, schools and libraries, you've got to have more skin in the game, so you've got to pay at least 15% of the discount rate. So that's what they did with the Wi-Fi crisis. The second thing they did is say, okay, we've got to get a handle on the spending. And so the first thing I said is we don't even know what people are, we know individually what people are spending, but we don't have sort of aggregate numbers of how much does 10 megabits cost across the country? How much different does it cost in rural versus urban areas? And so they said we're going to start make people put better data into the record so that we can get a better handle and understand what's going on. And so the USAC forms, which I already said are incredibly complex to begin with, are going to become even more complicated because there's going to be more data required of recipients to put into it. And the Commission concluded that that additional burden was justified because hopefully once all this data comes in and the Commission can understand it and then disseminate it back out, people will understand that if somebody is charging you $10,000 for 10 megabits a second, it's probably not a cost-effective price. If it's not competitive, you should be looking elsewhere. The second thing they said is you know, we found some success with consortia, and that is schools and libraries banding together to sort of increase their purchasing power by putting together a whole bunch of schools and libraries. And so we're going to encourage that. And eventually we're going to give some relief for some of the complexity of the program. But they also said it already becomes less less burdensome now, because if you have 10 schools instead of 1, now if you have one consortium filing an application for 10 schools, it's 1/10 the paperwork than it was before. And then the last thing they said is we really are going to get serious about this, requiring providers to offer the lowest corresponding price. What happened in practice out there was many carriers would rebrand services or put something slightly different within their service offering in response to a RFP that would allow them to charge more to a school or library than they did to a similarly situated customer by making them not similarly situated. You know, they're playing a little bit of gamesmanship was going on, and the result was, you know, the price was higher. Now, there is a justification for this, and remember what I said. In some instances, in many instances, the money wasn't actually flowing to the carriers to pay for these services until partway through the funding cycle. And so they weren't getting paid on a monthly basis for the services they provided necessarily. It was coming in a lump sum either in the middle or towards the end of the year. So there's some theoretical justification for doing these separately situated. But the Commission is saying, no, we really got to hold carriers' feet to the fire. They can't be offering anything that's close to a corresponding service at a different price. And finally, as I said, the Commission said we've got to find a way to streamline the application process.
Hey, Jim,
and so here's what they
this is Jim, this is Randy. So before we jump on and talk about the application process, we do have a question as far as a clarification about the 85% discount rate, and this is from a tribal ISP that serves E-rate schools and libraries on the reservation. And the question is, as a fixed wireless provider, when we serve a school or library and include Wi-Fi, should we now should expect only an 85% discount rate? And that's a request for clarification on that.
Yeah, what's going to happen there is you will only get the 85% discount rate as to the Wi-Fi side of it. You still could technically qualify for 90% for the internet connection part. And so probably the way to go there is to break it down now into two components, the internet connection side of it and the Wi-Fi side of it. And you would be able to get 90% on the internet connection costs, but only 85% for the Wi-Fi side of it. So think of it literally as the wire, to use the analogy, even if this is a wireless provider, the wire that hits the wall of the school, you would get 90% for that. The equipment that distributes that signal inside the school, you'd only be able to get 85%. So in other words, in order to take advantage to get the full 90%, you're probably going to have to break that into two components, get 90 on one and 85% on the other.
And then another follow-up question, which I think you're going to want to probably, I'm going to read it, and then you'll probably want to hold on to this because I think you're going to get to this on future slides. But the question is, when we're using school lunch programs with such a huge percentage of students from a tribal rancheria that qualify for that program, why would there not be a larger discount rate for for that type of qualification? In other words, why wouldn't there be a larger E-rate discount for a school that has such a a demonstrated need within the student population?
Yeah, I will come back to that. So yeah, let me defer that for just a minute here,
okay.
and I'll come back to it. Okay, so let's get back now to what the Commission did to simplify the application process. The simple answer is not a whole heck of a lot. And in fact, if you want to read an interesting dissent, read Commissioner Pai's dissent to the order, in which he said, essentially, you promised us, Commission, other commissioners, all the simplification, and you've given us basically none, which is, in fact, you're giving us less than none because with all the additional data that you're going to be requiring in these applications, the applications are actually going to be more complicated than they were before. So what the Commission did do is saying, all right, we will give you simplification in the form that we will now allow multi-year, as in two, a two-year contract. So you can enter into a two-year contract with a carrier, and for year two, you won't have to file anything. And so the Commission said, look, if you do multi-year contracting, that means that you're going to be able to cut your burden in half because you only have to do it every 2 years. Okay, that fair enough. That for many people who can take advantage of that, that will work. For many people, because of their own funding cycles, in terms of paying the non-discounted portion, that may not be available to them. If they're on an annual fiscal basis for their own funding for their portion, and they can't get a commitment from the tribe or the school district, whatever, to commit to out-year support, then they're not going to be able to take advantage of this and enter into a multi-year contract. The second thing they did was they exempted certain low-cost, high-speed business class broadband access. This is a really narrow one. The Commission said you don't have competitive bid stuff that's essentially off the shelf, readily available, and frankly, I doubt seriously there's much of that at all in Indian country. But there may possibly be some tribes that could qualify for that. They're going to ease the signing contract requirement. One of the sort of gotchas that came back to bite a lot of recipients was the requirement that you actually have a signed contract before you filed your forms, the second set of forms with USAC, and that was sometimes very difficult to do to get the given that the quick turnaround cycles on some of these things. You'd have to put out an RFP, accept the bid, and you'd have a very short time to get the contract signed, and that literally had to be physically signed before you filed with USAC. And so the Commission said we recognize that's a problem, and in fact there have been many appeals taken by folks up to the FCC for this failure to have a signed contract, and the Commission by and large has waived the rule and allowed it to go forward. The other thing the Commission said is they're no longer going to require technology plans. That used to be a big problem and an expense, because you'd have to get somebody to come in and lay out the physical plan of how you were going to roll out E-rate. And the Commission said with so much of the stuff being so turnkey now, there's no reason to do it. The next thing that is a, quote, simplification is to require that all of these forms be filed electronically. That's all well and good, except for the fact that nobody has actually developed these forms online. And so what it now means is, rather than mailing your forms 470s, 471, et cetera, to USAC, you're going to have to essentially email them until USAC gets around to actually creating online forms. I don't see that as much of a simplification, quite frankly. And finally, the last thing they're saying is to allow, in many instances, direct connection between schools and libraries, so that you could create a consortium that contained both schools and libraries. So, yes, there was some simplification, not certainly as much as most people had hoped. And I'm going to go over this very quickly. The Commission is trying to simplify the discount rate calculations, and frankly, unless you are neck deep in this stuff, this probably doesn't mean anything to you. And finally, simplifying the invoicing and disbursement process, sort of the back-end forms. The Commission has directed USAC to try and make them a little simpler. And so now you can directly invoice from schools and libraries to the carrier instead of going through USAC. And also, again, to try and quicken the process, adding additional deadlines on invoicing. This is stuff that if you've made your way through the E-rate process and are an E-rate participant now, this probably means something to you. If you haven't, if you aren't, then this is so far in the weeds, we really don't need to go into too much detail. Finally, the Commission said, look, USAC, you've been taking way too long to get these things done. And so they've directed USAC to adopt measures to try and speed up the review of the applications, speed up the commitment decisions and disbursements, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other one that they added in here, which I found a little bit curious, was requiring that all appeals initially go back through USAC. So, in other words, if USAC says, no, we're not going to fund you, in the old days, as in last month, you would then take that appeal directly to the FCC. Now, what the FCC says, no, take it back to USAC and explain to them why they're wrong. That doesn't seem to me to simply simplifying the process or even speeding it up. It adds a whole nother layer. And quite frankly, in the appeals that I've been involved in, USAC isn't really a friend at that point. Why do you want to take it back to them? But for whatever reason, the Commission said you got to take your appeal first to USAC. Hopefully, it will come with a little bit of a rap on the wrist, USAC to be a little bit more lenient. But then at the same token, the Commission acknowledges that USAC does not have any power to waive any of its rules. So if you take an appeal back to USAC, you can't say, well, USAC, please waive this filing deadline that I missed. USAC can't, which means they're going to issue a second denial, and then you're still going to have to take the appeal to the commission. So this was somebody's good idea. I don't know whose it was or whether in fact it was. Finally, they want to, the commission notes the waste, fraud, and abuse, and to make all our lives much easier, they are extending the document retention deadline from 5 to 10 years. So now you're going to have rooms and rooms and rooms of paper, and also making it very clear that an E-rate recipient can't essentially dodge the auditors. They can't, stick their head in the sand. They have to answer the doorbell when they come, or that is a separate grounds for denying support if you refuse to cooperate with auditors. So what did tribes get out of all of this? Well, we got some good stuff. Again, the commission recognized the historical trust relationship and responsibilities it has with federally recognized tribal nations. It notes the longstanding policy of promoting tribal self-sufficiency and economic development, and it is no stranger to the digital divide. It cited all of the things that Indian country has placed before it over the last 5 or 10 years in terms of the lack of access to telecommunications and broadband in Indian country. It notes all that. It gets it. And it also notes that tribal participation in E-rate has been low. It's been much lower than the rest of the country, and so it wants to do something to try and help that. And again, recognizing the poverty that exists in many tribal nations, the Commission notes that if the E-rate program was participated in by tribes more readily, good things can happen. So it wants to try and do something about it. So what it did was it ordered the Office of Native Affairs and Policy, ONAP. I hope most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with that term. That's Jeff Blackwell in his shop. So they've ordered them to conduct government-to-government consultation. That's a buzzword, but it's an important buzzword. Basically, ONAP needs to reach out to tribes, and tribes, you need to reach out to ONAP to talk with them about how to best collect this data as to tribal school and library participation. As I said, BIA, BIE has not been the most cooperative. They filed comments in this proceeding, but they lacked any sort of the specificity that anybody would want in terms of putting the data out. Secondly, ONAP is chartered to work with USAC to help develop tribal-specific training materials and an outreach program to assist tribes in participating in the E-rate program. That's never actually been done before. USAC does have programs, and it has tried to reach out to tribes in the past, but with very little success. I think partially because there is a certain lack of trust between tribes and USAC, because they're sort of the police officer in all this, whereas I think universally ONAP is considered to be a trustworthy government partner in all this. So the Commission says, ONAP, you figure out with USAC how to establish a training program to walk tribes through this, to help them get better involved in the programming. And finally, FCC ordered USAC to create a formal tribal liaison and assist, again, assisting with tribal-specific outreach training. And finally, and I think the one that's important here, is to have that tribal liaison be the point of contact for questions from tribal applicants. Many tribes just sort of have felt like they've gotten the runaround. Those who've tried to participate, they get shuffled off from one person to another person to another person at USAC when they've got dumb questions, when they got questions because they don't understand the process very well. And the Commission says, USAC, you've got to have a person who is going to make sure that those questions get answered. And so that's all a good thing, and that's things that I know that the National Congress and CAI asked for. That's certainly, I represent the Navajo Nation Telecommunications Regulatory Commission. Those are things that we asked for in it, and so that's all good. That's good stuff, and I hope it's going to be helpful going forward. But what didn't Indian country get that that was asked for. First, the Commission doesn't even mention the term tribal priority, something that was put forth by many in Indian country, asking the Commission to find some way to set aside a certain amount of money to make sure that it goes to Indian country because they're the most in need. The second thing that was asked for was an increase in the discount rate to 95% or even 100%. Noting the lack of economic development, the lack of resources in Indian country. And as I mentioned before and fielded in one of the questions, in fact, the discount rate's been rolled back for category services to 85%. So Indian country didn't come close to winning on that. And I don't think there's really much of a chance of ratcheting that back up. And so that's sort of an answer to that second question. There is not a whole lot of momentum at all. It's the reverse of that fact of getting increased amounts. The feeling is that 90%, that was a sweet deal, and you're never going to get anything close to that again. Even if the percentage enrolled in the student lunch program is 100%, that's still all you're going to get. What we also didn't get was, alluding back to my discussion of what's a tribal library. The Commission just ignored it, ignored the problem of getting letters from state librarians, ignored the fact that USAC looks askance at tribal libraries because they don't look like it. We got not even a mention in a 176-page order of those issues. And then finally, the other thing that was asked for by Indian country was a bit more flexibility in filing deadlines to account for the additional time that takes to comply with tribal acquisition regulations or the tribal fiscal year. No mention of anything to that sort in the order, but I'll talk about the possibility of getting that back in a moment here. So I filed comments. I was involved in multiple sets of comments. Quite frankly, I kind of take this as a personal defeat, not getting any of this stuff in and not even getting a mention of it. It was not the brightest day for those of us who advocate for Indian country based on what we asked for. But as I said, the fight's not over. The Commission issued a further notice of proposed rulemaking. Comments are due April 15, so about a month away in this. And there's a number of questions asked in the further notice, but two of which were specifically put in there to try and get comments out of Indian country. The first, as relates to the National School Lunch Program, the Commission asks, would the requirement to use state-reported NSLP data impact tribal schools, and if so, how? Is there alternative reporting data that would better reflect the level of economic disadvantage for tribal schools and libraries? That's where Indian country can come back in, I think, and argue for all sorts of things, possibly even an increase in the discount rate, although, as I said, I think that there's no momentum for doing that. But certainly the Commission has held that out. And then finally they're asking about encouraging consortium participation. What can we do to accommodate the unique financial constraints that schools and libraries on tribal lands deal with and the unique relationships among tribal nations? Should we, for example, establish different consortia rules for schools and libraries on tribal lands or operated by tribal nations? What should those rules be? Those are very broad questions, and I think provide Indian country a real opportunity to come in and tell a better story about what's gone on there. One of the problems we had, those of us who were advocating for Indian country, was putting together the numbers. Again, the data doesn't exist. And frankly, putting together some organizations that haven't traditionally worked together in the past. Tribal schools and tribal libraries don't interact all that much with each other. And so trying to pull them all into a consortium for commenting purposes wasn't necessarily completely successful by all of us. But we got another chance. So we got a chance to move forward. And as always, we encourage people to file comments to tell their story. Okay, questions. One thing I want to circle back for quickly before I take questions is I forgot to mention in terms of the things that ONAP is doing, what to expect and when to expect it. I was just at the ONAP workshop at Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, 2 weeks ago, and the Commission talked about what it was thinking about doing. One of the things some of you may know, ONAP has a learning lab in which it has put a number of different programs and a number of different things on computers. And one of the things they said is they're going to try now and put E-rate materials into that learning lab so that as they travel around meeting with tribal organizations and tribes, those materials will gain access. They're also going to do a roadshow. There are a number of other ONAP workshops planned in the future. What I would suggest is if you have not gotten an email from the FCC in the last month and you are related in any way to a tribe or tribal organization, write an email to native@fcc.gov, N-A-T-I-V-E @fcc.gov, and ask to be put on their email mailing list. They don't email stuff all the time, but as I said, if you haven't gotten several emails in the last month or so with the schedule of when their next events are, you're probably not on that list and you need to be on that list. So I would suggest, that's your homework take home for today, is make sure that somebody within your tribe or tribal organization is on that list and is getting those updates, because I'm sure the FCC is going to use that as a method of disseminating some of this new material we're going to put out. So with that, I'm going to open this up for questions and look forward to it.
Yeah, Tim, the first question, actually, let me just pick up on what you were saying about ONAP, and there's been some talk about an Oklahoma workshop. Have you heard anything definitive as to if that's taking place for sure, and if so, when and where?
I know it is. I didn't write down the dates. There is upcoming in, I'm thinking it's end of September, but whoever asked that question, again, email native@fcc.gov and ask about it. But I'm almost positive that it's sometime in September, either late September or early October in Oklahoma.
Tracy Morris just jumped in, so I guess the dates are the 16th to the 18th, but she's not sure about where. So, okay. And that goes back to what you're saying about making sure that folks are on the FCC ONAP's mailing list. And then just a request for clarification, if you could go back and just repeat real quickly what you said about the BIE schools and their status in terms of with respect to the E-rate program.
Well, BIE schools are certainly eligible under the E-rate program. The problem is we don't have the data on how many of them participate, and unfortunately, I'm speaking probably a little out of school here. I don't think BIE itself is that up to speed on the E-rate program because they are eligible. They absolutely are eligible, and it may just be that because BIE, works through its own sort of, administration, its own sort of regulatory aspects, but it's never considered about the fact that, essentially one government agency can get money for another, but BIE schools are eligible. So if anybody is involved with a BIE school, is getting services for the tribes from BIE and aren't in the E-rate program, the simple answer is ask them why. Ask them why they're not doing that. And I think the answer is they're just kind of clueless about the program.
We've got another follow-up question about dealing with invoicing, and this is, again, from a tribal service provider. They said they're currently invoicing schools and libraries directly, and then USAC, and then invoicing USAC on an annual basis. The question is, so now do we bill schools and libraries for the total, and then they get reimbursed from USAC?
Boy, that one, get that name and I'll be happy to email it back. I read that part of the order, but figured it would be a little bit too deep in the weeds for everybody. I think there is still the dual track method where you can go either way, but I know the Commission made some tweaks to that. If you get me that information, I'll be happy to get offline on and answer back to them.
Okay, we'll certainly do that follow up with that participant directly. And then our final question that we've got up now, and if for those attending, if you've got questions, we've got just a couple more minutes, but if you do have another question, if you want to type that in. Last question we've got is, do you know if the new regulations will have any impact on rural health care?
No, the rural health care program is actually a separate, completely separate program. There are 4 programs under the Universal Service Fund. There's the high-cost program, money that go to carriers to allow them to extend out service, the Lifeline link-up program, subsidies to consumers to be able to afford telephones, the schools and libraries or E-rate, which support schools and libraries, and then the healthcare program, which is a separate pot of money. It's not a very large pot of money. $2.4 billion for E-rate. I think the total budget for rural healthcare is $800,000. And that's actually undersubscribed substantially. The Commission has had a hard time even coming close to getting that much money out the door. So none of these rules will impact rural health care program at all.
Okay. And it looks like that is all of our questions. And so I want to thank everybody for participating in today's webinar. And Jim, thank you very much for the presentation. Our next scheduled webinar is on September 23rd. Greg Geis will be speaking about what tribes can be doing to make sure that their interests are heard as Congress looks to rewrite the Telecommunications Act. We've got several other webinars coming up in late September and then in November that are posted to the website. We'll encourage you to check back to the website often because we will be adding additional programs. And then finally, be sure and save the date for next year's conference, May 4 through 7 in Albuquerque. As I said earlier, the online registration form will be available just in the next day or two. We're also going to be sending out some really exciting information about keynote speakers and our program agenda here in just the next couple weeks, so stay tuned on that. And then finally, please take a couple minutes to complete our post-webinar survey. It's really a short survey, but it will help us to select future topics that are going to be most beneficial for you and your community. And with that, thank you again for attending today's webinar, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.